Welcome to Saltier Politics. We haven't been here for a while, but I'm excited. I think we're coming in strong with a fantastic interview that I have to say, I took a little backseat to this one because I saw Julie get that sparkle in her eye when she gets into a political conversation. Julie, that I remember on Outnumbered or on when you were on Fox.
Yeah, so we interviewed
Dave Spencer, the host of the Practically Political podcast.
who's a Rockefeller and is a member of the Rockefeller family and still a Republican, still a Rockefeller Republican, probably the last Rockefeller Republican standing, because I don't think there's many Rockefeller Republicans or any other kind of moderate Republicans left in the Republican Party. I thought it was a fascinating discussion and the kind of discussion that I wish more Democrats and Republicans could have, and the kinds of discussions that Emily, I remember having with Republicans in Washington when I first started out that unfortunately just don't exist anymore. They still do at the state level to some extent, but increasingly less so. It's kind of sad.
The thing is, we could have a conversation and actually talk about policy and talk about issues that I think move the conversation forward. And again, give good counterpoints, points back and forth. And I thought it was a joy.
Yeah, he was just really fascinating. I'm very glad that we spent, I think like an hour talking to him because he was just so interesting about his great uncle Nelson, and about his uncle Jay Rockefeller, who was the senator from West Virginia for a long time, which we will talk about on our podcast coming up next.
Joining Julie and I today is Dave Spencer, the host of the Practically Political podcast, a pragmatic Republican and Rockefeller heir. Dave, so great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So Dave, tell us what a Rockefeller Republican is these days, because I think the term is so outdated now. It seems like the Republican Party has just completely forgotten about the lessons of the Rockefeller family, or even Reagan for that matter. What do you think about that?
Well, yes, I think you're right. I will acknowledge that we are a severely endangered species, if there are any of us left at all. But the original Rockefeller Republican was someone who was socially more liberal, on things like abortion, but fiscally more conservative. And now, of course, the party has gone the opposite way, where it's fiscally irresponsible and, socially beyond right. It used to be that when you were, if you opposed abortion, at least everyone agreed on an exception for rape and incest, and you don't even get that anymore. So, yeah, it was really more than beliefs. It was the desire to work across the aisle. And that was really why a lot more things got done. So, yeah, I'm definitely one of the lone warriors, but I believe the only way to save the Republican Party is to burn the village to destroy it. And the problem is that right now there's no political price being paid for what's going on. So until that happens, it's a tough slog.
Well, you ask an interesting question, because to me, if you are thinking back to the trajectory of the Republican Party and how it got to this point, it's not Donald Trump. I wouldn't say it's even Ronald Reagan. I think there were symptoms of what was going on, which is effectively that the evangelical right, Ralph Reed and Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and all these other evangelicals, it seems to me really made the Republican Party a reflection of their beliefs on the social component. And so now it became much more, as you said, a socially conservative party, fiscal issues kind of be damned, which almost began once Nelson Rockefeller was no longer in office, right? It began kind of in the mid 70s and or late 70s and continued to go on that way. So I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, I think I view it in stages. I think the first stage really started with the election of Reagan. Not that Reagan was anything like that. In fact, he'd be tossed out of today's Republican Party on his derriere. So when I hear people like Ted Cruz quoting him and lionizing him, like please. But so the religious right started to drag the party to the right and make a lot of these social issues relevant. Then you had, on the personal side, you had the demonizing, which really began with Newt Gingrich in the 90s. And then as far as people being elected, you had the Tea Party, which came along and really made purity okay, made the not being able to compromise a part. And then, of course, the final stage is really the big lie, which has been internalized by so many Republicans. And that's now what is really scary, is that you have people, except for a couple of lone wolves, the Adam Kinzingers, the Liz Cheneys, you have basically people who are, if they're not denying it, if they're not supporting it, they're not denying it. People like Kevin McCarthy. And, I think I'm very worried. I think we're headed for some major potential constitutional crisis here. But those are the stages.
Do you think
that's how I see how the party went off the deep end.
Do you think the Republican Party is headed for a reckoning? Because it strikes me that the Republican Party is in a very good position next year to regain control of both houses of Congress. It seems to me like there is not just no penalty to be paid for veering way to the right, but actually a reward in some cases in the Republican base for veering to the right and among the electorate. There are voting restrictions being put into place in places like Texas and other places. Pennsylvania is another good example where the legislature has veered to the right, where they're trying to put voting restrictions in. And if they win a gubernatorial election next year, they will be able to do that effectively because they'll control both branches of government in Pennsylvania. And that seems to me that would actually help the Republican Party, this rise towards authoritarianism, because they will be able to then disenfranchise enough Democratic voters or potential Democratic voters to be able to win. So is there really a reckoning that's coming for the Republican Party, or are they rolling the dice and playing for the whole thing the way Mitch McConnell did on the Supreme Court with Merrick Garland? It seems to me like they're just extrapolating those lessons and doing that state by state now.
Yeah, I agree. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's no political price being paid for this. And until there is, it's going to keep right on happening. And if you take a look even at 2020, a lot of people will say, well, they lost. Well, in the minds of people like Kevin McCarthy, Trump was the only problem. They lost the presidency because people didn't like Trump. They lost the Senate because Trump interfered in those two races in Georgia, but they gained seats in the House. They didn't lose state legislatures. I think the Democrats had a real chance of taking over some legislatures, but they didn't because they talked about, instead of kitchen table issues that worked in 2018, they talked about defunding the police and Medicare for all and the Green New Deal, which most Americans don't want to hear about. So, yes, I think you're right. Until there's a price to be paid, they're going to keep on doing it. And the strategy is, whether you agree with it or not, that demographically the party is screwed, right? So the only way to stay in power is to rig the system. And that's going to be done by challenging the legitimacy of elections if they lose, by making it harder for people to vote. And the part that really scares me in some of these states like Georgia, allowing state legislatures to overturn elections, because all the election rules and all the changes that have come in really so far have been a wash prior to 2020. So I don't really buy when people say, oh, voter suppression has been going on since voter ID in 2005 or whatever. No, 2020 was a record turnout for Biden, a record turnout for Black voters. So the party realized, instead of having laws that affect while the vote's being cast, we need to be able to do things after the vote's being cast. And so Georgia is a classic example. There's a very insidious law. It allows them to overrule counties. Well, you would say, hey, there's only 4 counties and they only can do 4 counties. Georgia's got 159 counties, second only to Texas. What's the big deal? Well, if those 4 counties are Cobb, Gwinnett, DeKalb, and Fulton County, they could overturn the election, right? I mean, because in Trump's mind, if you could get rid of Atlanta, Philadelphia, and Detroit, he'd be president, which actually, if you look at the votes, is true. So that's the strategy. And it's pretty scary, but they realize that's their only chance. So they're going to go all out until they pay a price.
So that's my question, I guess.
Yeah.
Are they ever going to pay a price? Are you optimistic that the Republican Party will pay a price enough to get back to your family's legacy, or even Reagan? I mean, even becoming a center-right party as opposed to the authoritarian party that they have become. Even Bush. I mean, if you think about.
Oh yeah.
I'm not optimistic based on everything you just said that that's the case. And you're talking about Georgia, which is a great example, but you're also, I think back to just recently where they had the Maricopa County recount in Arizona, which if Trump could get rid of Phoenix and Maricopa County, he would have won Arizona as well.
Yeah.
And if you think about what they've done, that audit, everybody thinks was a joke because it showed at the end that there were more votes for Biden than there were when they began. But the reality is it was actually a brilliant strategy for the people who oppose Biden and oppose any kind of free and fair elections. It's given them a roadmap now, right, to be able to look and see where these votes came from, how it's just, to me, this is a roadmap that was created to help in places like Georgia, to help in places potentially like Pennsylvania, as I said, if a Republican wins the governorship there next year, and so on and so forth.
That is, yes, I think you're right. Until there's a political price to be paid, they're going to go on doing this. And the best way to make them pay a political price was for the Democrats to understand that they don't have a mandate. And the best way to get power is to win more seats, to be patient, pass things that Americans want, get a couple more seats in the Senate, get more seats in the House, then they can actually govern. But the Democrats, being the feckless and incompetent herding cats people that they are, the perfect is the enemy of the good. So Biden needs a win, and they're on the verge of derailing an infrastructure bill that 70% of the country wants, because they want this progressive wish list that very few people want. So the best chance was to show Americans that Democrats can govern and can give people what they want, because already they're swimming upstream. Only twice in this century has a president gained seats in a midterm, the first midterm, and that was FDR in 34 and George W. after 2002, and that was after a major crisis. So Biden, I think, had a chance. I wrote a piece about this, that if the Democrats played their cards right, they could gain seats in 22, but the Delta variant and a few other things, and there's been a lot of unforced errors. So right now, if you look at Obama's approval ratings, which are the primary criterion of how well the midterms go or don't go,
it's Biden.
It's Biden's approval rating. It's looking pretty bad. So right now, it was always going to be pretty close. Pretty sure that they take the House. And right now, if things don't change, they're probably a lock to take the Senate, which, as you say, will allow them to keep going with this. And the worry is that even when the demography changes, that there'll be a built-in advantage that's locked in for enough time where they'll be able to do enough damage and hold on to power long enough. So yeah, I think they're making it harder and harder for them to pay a price, which is the whole point. So I'm not optimistic either right now.
What's interesting to me is that the average voter in the United States, in these swing areas, is, and I don't think Democrats focus on this enough, is a white, non-qualified man.
Yeah, and those are the voters that came over from Trump. And as James Carville said last time, a lot of what the Dems are doing now is going to be a great platform in 2050, when this is a majority minority country. But last time I checked, the next election, 2/3 of this country is still going to be white. So I think a lot of the strategy, both in terms of the demography and in terms of a lot of the suburban upper income, particularly women voters that couldn't stomach voting for Trump, and also voted for the Dems in 2018 because they were talking about jobs and the economy and education and the minimum wage and healthcare and kitchen table issues. That's where there's very little daylight between the Trump voters that went for Obama twice and went for Trump, is on kitchen table issues. There is a huge amount. There are light years between them when it comes to issues like defunding the police and open borders and abortion till birth and all this stuff that's being pushed. And I just think strategically it's really poor.
My question is it really being pushed, or is it being pushed by a right-wing ecosystem, including Fox News, where I worked for a long time? I don't know that most Democrats, if any, very few Democrats, would support abortion until birth. I don't think most Democrats, if any, there's very few, I guess, that talk about defunding the police. It's become something of a orthodoxy among conservative voters that this is what Democrats are communicating. In fact, Democrats are just doing a really, really poor job of communicating what they stand for, but it's certainly not abortion up until birth, and it's certainly not defunding the police. At least this Democrat doesn't support that, and most Democrats I know don't support that. My larger question, though, is if you're a Democrat, I'll just be devil's advocate on this because I don't really disagree with you. But if you're a Democrat and you're looking at the Republicans and you're looking how way to the right they went and how there was no let's temper ourselves. Let's have, let's not give Donald Trump everything he wants. Let's really just temper ourselves and think about the fact that this is not the country that it was 50 years ago. This is a pluralistic society with, Republicans never did that. Republicans went for it. I mean, they got every single thing on their wish list, including just banning abortion, even in cases of rape and incest in Texas. And yet getting the Supreme Court that they want. Nobody said, well, I don't know, should we really not do this Merrick Garland move because it really might alienate some people? Republicans just went for it. And I think if you're a progressive Democrat, and I'm just extrapolating where I think the heads of people like Bernie Sanders, for example, are, the House Progressive Caucus, is that they're saying, what the hell? The Republicans went for it. We should go for it. And we should try to get what we can now when we have the majority in both houses of Congress and a Democratic president. Why not?
Well, yes. Well, first of all, I agree with you that Republicans understand power and how to use it, and
They sure
Democrats don't. They also understand that the American people really don't care that much about process, and they don't care very much about a lot of issues that aren't at the front burner. A classic example of that is, I don't think in the history of American politics there's ever been 360 degrees of brazenness in terms of hypocrisy, in terms of shredding precedent than Merrick Garland and what happened after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. I mean, the hypocrisy of these guys was just so galling. And a month later, nobody cared. So if nobody cared about that, they're not going to care about any process. And I think also Republicans understand that when they get things through, a lot of it is on narrower stuff where they have total control, but they also don't shoot themselves in the foot in terms of what's important to their base. And so that's why this thing of holding the first infrastructure bill hostage to a bill that doesn't have the votes in the Senate as we speak right now, because Manchin and Kristen Sinema, those two senators, aren't going to go for it. So what would have happened is that Republicans would have talked to them ahead of time, figured out exactly what they were going to offer. So let's say it's $2 trillion. They would make noise about their bigger plan, then say, okay, we're going to compromise. Let's try a $2 trillion plan. That would pass, and then they would pass Biden's plan. That's how the difference in the parties. They understand power. They have a strategy. The Democrats, it's like, as I say, it's like herding cats, and this has happened over and over again. So I agree with you. It's just, to me, it's not so much what they want. It's the execution and the understanding how to navigate the waters. I just think the GOP is much better at that when it comes to Congress.
I agree, but you've now talked about voter suppression. You've now talked about veering to the right to embrace Trumpism for political expediency, for ideological reasons. Reconcile that with Ron DeSantis for me, and the fact that you seem to not dislike Ron DeSantis the way that some of us do.
Well, my problem with Ron DeSantis is that, and Greg Abbott is like this too, at the very end, feeding the base comes first. And where they both really lost me was on these mandates, where you're basically telling, I have a small business. And the fact that someone, particularly a Republican who always talks about conservatism as letting those decide closer to who's being governed, closest on the laws. Really? So you're a bureaucrat who's 300 miles away in Tallahassee, and you're going to tell me that I can't require vaccinations? Or a cruise company? I mean, cruises can't require vaccinations? Give me a break. So that's where he lost me. I think he's done some good stuff on the environment, and I think he's done some other good things. But what I really, I don't care for him personally, but I think what I admire about him is that he's realized that the heir apparent to Trump is going to be someone who doesn't offend the base, but also actually governs, someone who's actually educated and does his homework and pays attention to what people want. I think DeSantis had done a good job of that, but I think he really stepped in it with this Delta variant thing, and I think it's set him back a lot in Republican circles.
Pre-Delta variant thing, when I was listening to, you were interviewed by Clay Aiken, and you said that Ron DeSantis was a huge threat to the Democrats, and he's a player that they should be afraid of. Who do you think?
Yeah, that point, he was the most likely person to get the 24 nomination.
But who do you think is a Democrat's version of this? And do you think we have one?
I don't think necessarily. I think there are people like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema who come from swing states, and Joe Manchin, because my uncle served for almost 40 years in West Virginia. I know that state pretty well. There's not another Democrat on this planet who could hold that Senate seat. So yes, he can be a pain, but he's voted with him every time. And so in terms of the next wing of Democrat who's going to be the heir apparent, that's one of the problems, is that the bench is very thin. I don't think that there's someone who really can step up right now. And I think there's also been a problem with Kamala Harris. I think someone like if Amy Klobuchar were vice president, I think she'd be a much better heir apparent. But I think Kamala Harris has proved herself to not be very deft. And I just don't think that she's a very skilled politician. But it's really hard to not have her the heir apparent. So I think that because I don't see Biden running again. I don't know what you folks think, but I think he's going to have trouble finishing this term. I don't see how he can run for.
Oh, I think he runs.
Term.
I think if his health is fine, he runs again. I think the problem for Kamala Harris is that they've given her every horrible job. They've given her every no-win job on earth, right?
But is that a coincidence?
Well, it may not be a coincidence. The only thing I would say to Kamala Harris, if I were to talk to her, is why don't you ask for something that can give you a win and not just be the person that's being sent down to the border. Ultimately, I think the problem for Democrats has always been, and I think Bill Clinton used this great line, maybe it's not his, where he said Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line.
Yes.
And we Democrats, look, if I thought about who the bench, I remember being in college in 1991 thinking if Mario Cuomo doesn't run, George Bush gets reelected. Now, this is at the very end this is late 91. Bush's numbers were starting to soften a little bit, I guess, but not much because of the Iraq War, the first Gulf War. I just remember when Cuomo made that decision on the tarmac not to get on that plane to New Hampshire and basically pulled out of the race. I remember thinking, oh my God, that's it. We're never going to have anybody. Who are these people who's this lame governor from Arkansas? Paul Tsongas is lame. Everybody's lame. You kind of started thinking, going through the list, and then lo and behold, Bill Clinton pulled it out. If somebody had told me back in 2007 that an African-American guy named Barack Hussein Obama, who was a first-term senator from Illinois, was ever going to be successful, I would have laughed. And in fact, I supported Hillary Clinton in that primary, not necessarily because I supported her policies more than his, but because I just thought she was the more electable candidate. I was completely wrong about that. I didn't realize back then, I guess what I realize now, which is there'll be 100 Black men who will get elected before one woman ever gets elected in this country, because the misogyny is so much worse than anything else. So
Hillary's her own worst enemy, too.
Hillary may have been her worst enemy, but I'll tell you something. If you saw the way women were treated, Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and every other woman who ran, there is a built-in animosity that we have towards women, and that includes women towards other women, by the way. It's not just a problem of men. But and Sarah Palin too. Sarah Palin, for all her problems, I think got treated worse as a woman than she would have been if she were a man, because Dan Quayle was no more. That's true. Dan Quayle was no more incompetent or competent than she was. So the only thing I'd say to you about that is, we'll find somebody, and I don't know necessarily that Democrats never have developed a strong bench. What Democrats always developed was that one guy that they fall in love with and suddenly becomes like the chosen. Look at the Republican bench in 2012. Look at the great bench they had. They had two senators I could think off the top of my head, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. Whatever you think of them, they were sitting senators. You had Jeb Bush, a 2 or 3 term governor of Florida and a member of the Bush family. Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, who was incredibly popular before Bridgegate and before he decided to throw his arms around Obama during Hurricane Sandy. So you had an incredible bench, and out of this incredible bench comes this huckster reality show host who is anathema to everything Republicans have always said they stood for: fiscal responsibility, even the social aspects of things. A thrice married man who talked about his sex life and cheated on his wives very openly in the New York tabloids. Donald Trump was everything the Republicans stood against. And all I could think is you have people like Marco Rubio or people like Ted Cruz, who from the day they probably came out of the womb started grooming themselves to run for president and behaved accordingly to what they thought the Republican base wanted. And here comes a guy like Donald Trump who blows all of that up and turns it on its head and wins, and probably wins the primary. So, and the election. So I guess Democrats probably have the same thing, right? There'll be another somebody, whether it's Kamala Harris or it's going to be somebody else. By the way, Kamala Harris's numbers, the last poll I saw, were better than Biden's, which tells you something.
Yeah. Well, no, it's true. And look, the same thing is true with Jimmy Carter, right? I mean, he came out of nowhere. So
Yeah.
absolutely, that's why it's always good if you're going to run, because the one thing that's predictable about presidential primaries is that they're unpredictable. So every forecast of who the front runner was going to be, you go back, has been wrong, and every person that's got in early and really put their pedal to the metal has benefited. So I think that there probably will be someone who comes out. It's a little harder now because when you look at Bill Clinton and certainly Jimmy Carter, they came from southern states when the South was a lot more blue, so they were different types of Democrats. But every president has had something that's allowed them to peel votes from the other side. I think it's one of the most unappreciated qualities. And I think with Obama, it was, we're one nation, we're not red or blue, we're one nation. With Clinton, he was the new Democrat. Who, George W. Bush, it was compassionate conservatism, all this stuff. And I think Trump's what I think the most underrated quality that got him the election was, first of all, the dynamics were going in his favor. And only twice in history has somebody won a so-called third term. In other words, someone's been reelected and then someone from the same party has won. Gore should have done it, but he ran the worst campaign in history. But you had George H.W. Bush after Reagan, and then you have to go all the way back to Martin Van Buren after Andrew Jackson. And coincidentally, each of them were only one-term presidents, as was Trump. But so it's very hard to win a so-called third term. Plus, it was a change election, and there was a lot of things going against it. But Trump's underrated quality was that he was considered the most moderate GOP candidate since Eisenhower. Now, of course, he didn't govern that way, but the fact that he'd been a Democrat only recently, a lot of people thought, okay, this guy's more moderate than a lot of guys. Plus, he's going to blow up the system. Plus, I hate Hillary Clinton. And, it all came together with a perfect storm. But my favorite stat, and I always say this, is when you talk about the Democrats being the enemy of the good, it's like if my guy or my way doesn't go, then we all go down. In Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the three states that won the election, there were 2 to 3 times as many voters as Trump's margin of victory who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, who voted for Trump in the general. In Pennsylvania, Trump won by 44,000 votes. Over 100,000 Bernie primary voters voted for him in the general. My reaction is, what? So next time you see a Bernie bro in Pennsylvania, thank him for handing Trump the election.
Well, it's funny that you say this. I'm actually doing the show from Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And
that'll be a good stat.
Yeah, I can tell you it's interesting where I am, and I live in New York, but I'm in Pennsylvania this weekend. Where I am is actually Northampton County, which is the swingiest county in Pennsylvania, which is arguably the swingiest state in the nation. And the town where I am, Biden won, but won by a minuscule number. And what's so interesting about that is that everywhere I went, and still go whenever I'm here, you still see the Trump flags everywhere. Like, everywhere. People haven't taken them down. And what that says to me is this is not so much about an election, it's a lifestyle to these people.
Right.
A lot of these people. There's a guy, whenever we're here, we always joke, who literally has a bike that he's wrapped up in Trump flags. He wears a Trump flag and a Trump shirt, and he's got a Trump flag on his little bike like a streamer. He's got a baby in the back of the bike, and like a baby kind of, I don't even know what it's called, but basically a place to put his baby. The baby's dressed in Trump clothes. And if you're out to lunch in this town, you'll see him biking up and down the street, almost as a walking billboard, for no reason, not because he's getting exercise. I think just to advertise. He'll by the way, he'll blare patriotic music as he's doing this. So it's interesting because it really is a lifestyle to people, I think, in ways that nothing else ever has been. I mean, I think about even Reagan in the 80s, as much as people loved Ronald Reagan, I don't remember anybody ever keeping Reagan signs up on their lawn past election day.
Well, let's face it, it's a cult.
It is.
I know people, when those of us who've been never Trumpers started saying that, how many years ago people thought we were being hyperbolic, but now I think pretty much everyone agrees. Because, and that frauded, as they call it in Arizona, was a perfect example of how, in most cases, people would say, okay, we did it your way.
Yeah.
settled, right? No, I mean, it wasn't even acknowledged. It's as you say, it's part of the plan that's being formulated to learn from the mistakes of 2020, so they'll be able to overturn future elections. But going back to people living and breathing in Trump, and he can never do anything wrong. That's something that you're seeing more and more. And I think that so many people, and those of us who study politics get it, but so many people keep saying, God, how can those people in those states vote for Republican? No one's been more inimical in terms of economic policy, and that's true. But the bottom line is, Julie, people used to vote solely with their pocketbooks. They don't do that anymore. They vote on cultural issues, racial issues, social issues, and I understand. I spent time in a lot of these states. I understand why the hillbilly elegy crowd supported Trump. For them, the American dream is dead. They were discarded by Democrats. They're in economically hollowed out areas that have been riddled by addiction. And this guy came along. He's a charlatan. He's a con man, and he pretended to care, and they bought it.
I get it. And what I think the problem, I remember being on Fox the day after the election on a show called Outnumbered that I used to co-host.
That would have been fascinating.
And so I remember saying this as a Democrat, obviously, who was shocked that Trump won. I think all of us were a little shell-shocked, on both sides of the aisle. Some people really believed he was going to win, but they were delusional about Romney winning too in 2012. I think the Democratic Party has a perception problem of being condescending to people like this. The Democratic Party has become so urbanized in the sense that that's where Democrats are concentrated, right? If you're a white Democrat, chances are you're an urban Democrat, or at least a suburban Democrat. And I think there's a perception that Democrats look down on people who are not college educated, who look down on people who are not necessarily financially successful. I think there's a huge fear. You talked about the hillbilly elegy crowd, but there's a huge fear. And it's interesting because the author of Hillbilly Elegy, who went to Yale, is now running.
Oh my God! What he's gone off the
is now running for Senate in Ohio, and ironically enough, is exploiting them, knowing full well what he's doing. Exactly what I'm about to say, but I think there's a sense the demographic changes that are plaguing this country in their mind, which are of course not plaguing this country in my mind, are coming for them. That people who are undocumented immigrants are suddenly going to take their jobs, even though that's not true, or somehow take their spot somewhere in life, which is not true. And not just that, but African Americans and women. And, they want to go back to the good old days, which I guess were the 1950s in their mind, or whatever it was, where you had stability, where if you went to work at a factory the day you graduated high school, you retired from that factory at the age of 65. And you had security, and you had sense of feeling like you were getting up and having a purpose every day to go to work and collect your paycheck and support your family and still have time and money to take vacations. And all of that is gone. And I get it. I completely get it. The fact that the Republican Party, of course, is mouthing these platitudes in my mind while voting specifically to provide tax breaks to the very people who exploit these kinds
of course.
People is interesting to me, which I guess raises the question for me. You live in the Bay Area, right? You're south of San Francisco.
I'm born and raised in Manhattan, but I've been a California boy for quite a while.
Okay. So you're by Silicon Valley or somewhere down by Monterey?
Yeah, I'm in a place called Hillsborough. I'm about third of the way between San Francisco and Silicon Valley.
Got it. So you're in an area that's kind of descriptive of what I'm talking about, where a lot of Democrats live. And you obviously you're still a registered Republican, right, in California?
I am. Yeah.
So tell me why. And I don't mean that as a gotcha question. You now have pretty much outlined what you think the Republican Party has become. In California, the Republican Party has been hijacked by the same element that we talked about nationally, because you had a couple of good guys in your mind. You had a couple of, I don't know if they were Rockefeller Republicans per se, but a couple of fiscally conservative, socially liberal guys running in the
Kevin Kiley was the guy.
Yeah, in this recall election. And yet they were all by the wayside. And Larry Elder, who's like Trump on steroids, was the face of the Republican Party in California. So why would you still, is it a sense of just your family's been Republican for so long, it's what you know, and it's hard for you to reconcile to becoming something else or not being a Republican? Why are you still a Republican?
Well, there's really part of it is I have a real sense of loyalty, and I'm going to keep espousing what needs to happen, and I hope that people will listen. But part of it is there's really not any other place for me to go too. I think it's nice to be registered to a party. Being an independent doesn't really stand for much. And if this were Bill Clinton's Democratic Party, then I might think about it. But the party, though it's not nearly as bad as the Republicans, and it's policy, it's not ethics, it's not authoritarianism, it's not all this other stuff. But party's gone so far to the left. But I just want to comment on something that you said before, and that is about how you were talking about the strategy they have, and it's all part of it. It's a bigger strategy. Is you keep talking about all these crises, right? There's a crisis on the border, there's an economic crisis, there's an inflation crisis, there's this crisis, because basically a classic authoritarian strategy is you foment chaos, so people are willing to sacrifice freedoms and rights to get order, and that's the big part of the strategy. And if you look at so much of what's being done, that's it. And it's a very nefarious, scary strategy. But I just go back to what I've said before. I don't believe it. We have a two-party system. Third parties don't work. The two-party system served us very well for a long, long time. So I think that dealing with things like dark money, I think dealing with things like trying to address gerrymandering, more and more states are starting to have independent redistricting, which helps. I think that will continue to catch on. But the Democrats have to be a viable alternative. And that's what worries me, is that what you're seeing right now is I know some swing voters that are starting to say, you know what, this is not what I consider a viable alternative. And the scariest stat you're seeing is that in some polls now, Trump is starting to poll better than Biden.
Well, so to that point, I guess if you're a Republican who's still a Republican,
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reason you're a Republican, your reasons are obviously very valid. Do you even think about voting for a Democrat ever, or do you just say,
"Oh yeah,
I'm going to stay home"? I mean,
in fact, to be honest with you, the last Republican that I voted for in the presidential election was George H.W. Bush. Because I think if Mitt Romney had ran as who he was, I would have considered supporting him. If George W. Bush had actually, tried to be more responsible in a lot of ways, I might have considered supporting him. But unfortunately, I don't think there's really been any great GOP candidates recently. So a lot of times it was more the lesser of evils. And I think that's another thing people have to realize, is that every time there's a presidential election, it's more like the scenario where you go to a dinner, right? And you really want beef, and they're serving chicken and fish. And if you hassle the waiter enough, maybe you can get a vegetarian entree. So it's not who do I like more, it's who do I dislike less. And coupled with that sadly, I think more people in this country are now voting to say F you than they are to say thank you. And
yeah.
So you put in those two dynamics, and that's why someone like Trump can get elected, because it's always the lesser of evils, and it's who's going to buck the system more, and who's going to, show Washington what they need to see, and all this stuff. And of course, that never ends up happening because people get in there. And I think Trump's one of the reasons he lost, I think even despite the economy, he still could have been reelected if it weren't for his erratic behavior and the fact that he ran as a populist, but he governed pretty much as a plutocrat.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, it's just interesting to me because I share the same sense. Emily, I don't know if you had ever had this happen to you, but I don't think I've ever said this publicly. All the years that I lived in New York and still live in New York, never voted for Andrew Cuomo. And I'm a Democrat, and I never voted for him in the primaries the first time around. I never voted for him in the general election, and for reasons that are apparent now. But I had serious problems with him going back, to when he first ran. What's interesting to me is, though, you're right. It became a thing of I don't really it's not that I support the policies. And by the way, his policies were very much aligned with mine in many cases, but this is more of a personal thing for me. But the question for me, I guess, much like for you, is, do we ever get to the point where we start voting for people based on who we love and not on who we hate? And I think that's it. Well, the Trump people certainly, I should take that back. The Trump people definitely vote. And I should say I voted for Joe Biden because I've known Joe Biden a long time, and I actually really, really like him. But the Trump people, to me, vote for Donald Trump because they truly love Donald Trump. They truly, truly love Donald Trump. And you went back to the Bernie bro people in Pennsylvania, why they voted for Trump. It's because they truly hate Hillary Clinton. She was the Antichrist. She needed to be erased because in her mind, and I'll quote Susan Sarandon here or paraphrase her, if we only get rid of the Hillary Clintons of the world, then the Bernie wing will be ascendant, which is a completely naive misunderstanding of life. Mm-hmm. But on the Republican side, tell me if you disagree with this, it seems to have worked, right? If only we get rid of George Bush and the Jeb Bush, the populists will be ascendant. And they have been. I mean, they have been. Look at Ron DeSantis, great example. I mean, Ron DeSantis's background is entirely, as is Donald Trump's, by the way, entirely.
Or Josh Hawley.
Or Josh Hawley. I mean, yeah. I mean, these guys are not. They're not hillbilly elegy. I mean, I'll take Vance. I mean, he actually, I guess, came from that background before going to Yale. Although I guess that kind of doesn't make him that much of a hillbilly either in his own mind. These this actually all began, now that I think about it, when Romney ran against Obama, and in one of the debates, and I almost fell off my chair watching this, Romney slammed Obama for having gone to Harvard Law School. Like, you don't get these Harvard Law School values. I'm thinking, you're Mitt Romney. You went to law school and Harvard Business School. And also, you're Mitt Romney. You ran being cap. Like Mitt Romney could not be more establishment, could not be more of that guy. And listen, this is the wing of the party that you come from. This is the family, your family legacy. I mean, you're a Rockefeller. You tell me, was your upbringing, forget the fact that you're a Rockefeller, but it seems to me I'm certainly not a Rockefeller. I did not grow up with a lot of money at all, but my parents would have sold their house and probably did sell their house to make sure that if I wanted to go to Harvard Law School, that I would have gone to Harvard Law School. That was something to attain. That was something to aspire to. When did that stop being something to aspire to? When did being educated, I'm not talking about Harvard specifically, but when did getting a really good education stop being something that we aspire to in the Republican Party?
Well, it's absolutely congruous with the rise of populism, because you look back, populism, a big tenet of it is a rejection of the elites. That's why Trump had such a problem with COVID, because if you support what the scientists say, if you support wearing masks, if you want people to get vaccinated, that's supporting scientists, and scientists are elitists. And that's the same thing. And if you look at people in the Trump administration, by the way, for the record, there's plenty of people that went to Ivy League schools, including whether or not he got in there legitimately, including the former president himself. So there's as usual, there's a surfeit of hypocrisy here, but that's really it. That's when, to answer your question, that's when Harvard became evil. That's when medical science became evil. It's with populism, and populism, by the way, it's all inequality, right? That's what breeds populism, and you look at it all over. You look at Marine Le Pen in France. You look at Brazil. I mean, Bolsonaro. Oh my God! I never thought anyone could make Trump look good. And all these guys, it's the same thing. It's inequality that fosters this resentment of people that the system is leaving behind. And a lot of people, no one begrudges wealth in this country, but people do begrudge that the system is rigged. And frankly, it is in a lot of ways.
Well, it is rigged. I agree with that. But let me challenge you on that, because Donald Trump certainly played up his Wharton, which he, of course, did not go to Wharton Business School. But be that as it may, okay, he still went to Penn. He still did programs at Wharton. But let me challenge you on that, because Trump did play up the fact that he did, I went to one of the best schools in the country, and Ivanka went to one of the best schools in the country, and my son's all, whatever. If you talked about his SATs and he go ballistic, I had perfect scores and I had perfect this and I had perfect that academically. So he's certainly, on the one hand, and his base just kind of let that go. Like, if you're going to say that these elites don't get it, how does somebody like Donald Trump, who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and
well, again, that is the thing about Trump, which even compared to Bill Clinton, who was great at taking shots and keep company. You think about the Jennifer Flowers story and all this stuff, and it was supposed to derail his pregnancy. He literally was someone that none of this stuff has stuck with, right? Nothing has stuck with him at all. He's gotten away with so much stuff, and so if you look at a lot of other people that have been with him, that rule does apply to them, but none of these rules apply to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so weird to me. And then I look at your state and I wonder what's the future for the Republican Party in California? I mean, is it even worth being a Republican in California, or is it worth, if you want to move the Democratic Party more to the center and make it more of a Bill Clinton party, as you claim you would have supported Clinton if you were running today, or you become a Democrat? Is it worth trying to influence the party in the largest Democratic union to do that?
Well, California has become obviously a one-party state, but I think a lot of people, and obviously myself included, are getting sick of a lot of the inefficiencies here. And I think that if someone talks about what good governance is about, that might have an effect. I also think this recall did a couple of good things. I think that it might be a wake-up call to the party. And I think if Gavin Newsom, actually, some of the stuff that he's trying to do in terms of climate and housing has actually been good. His main problem is his demeanor and his unforced errors, and the fact that he's like that guy you meet at a party that's always looking past you for the next person to meet.
Yep.
He's always got his eye on higher office, and so maybe he might realize that after this, he's not going to be president, and he's got 5 years left. I think he'll get reelected easily, just the way Scott Walker did after his recall. And I think he can be a great governor. He can solve the water crisis we have here, which is not a water shortage; it's an allocation crisis. And he can do a lot of good things and have a huge legacy. So, but to answer your question, it's very, very tough. In the way that the things have been set up, it's very tough. And it's the same thing in a lot of these red states. It's very hard for the Democrats to gain. But tides change. Don't forget, 10 years ago, North Dakota had 2 Democratic senators. So, yep. Things can change. I think this goes in waves. And the good news for the Dems is that white working class men, which are Trump's number one demographic group, are the fastest shrinking one in the country. And if I were a Democratic president, I would focus on bringing those parts of the country back economically, because that's what's going to turn things around more than anything.
Let me just ask you a quick question. Do you think that's possible, or do you think some of those places that have been eviscerated have just become so programmed to, for whatever reason, support Trump and believe in Trump and watch a lot of conservative TV news to the exclusion of everything else, that even if you bring jobs to them, like Obama to some extent saved the auto industry during the fiscal crisis in the late aughts, and Michigan didn't give him much credit for that, or Democrats much credit for that down the road during the Trump-Hillary race. So I wonder if that's even something that whether reason actually resonates, whether policy is something that still matters, or whether it's all rhetoric and performative art. Right.
Well, I think in the end, policy does matter. And I think that's where, again, if the Democrats focus on the kitchen table issues where there's very little daylight between Trump voters and them, and that's one of the great things about infrastructure, is that it spreads the wealth. It brings jobs to a lot of these parts of the country that haven't really seen a lot of economic activity. And you can set up economic opportunity zones, just as I think you should in cities, to help these poor communities get better jobs and have more economic opportunities. So I think in the end, policy does matter, and I think that's the best shot. And again, cults never outlast their leaders, and I still think that by the time we get to 2024, Trump's going to have a lot more legal baggage. And I think that his health is also going to be slipping. And so I think that there's a lot of things that will make it harder for him to run. My hope is that he sucks all the oxygen and all the money up for as long as possible. And that at the very end, someone else has to run, but they're going to be handicapped because they're not going to have the head start or the resources to run their best possible campaign.
I like that note. And now to get to the final part of our podcast, Two Truths and a Lie. Dave, if you would go. Julie, as I told you earlier, always beats me.
I know. I hear Julie is really good at this. So
yeah.
I've been doing a little practice to try to come up with something else, but I think I fooled 4 out of 5 people, Julie. So let's see how good you are.
You know what?
Okay?
One person did fool me in the whole history of this podcast and the years we've been doing this. One person, I forgot who it was, did fool me. So we'll see if you're the second. It's been a long time since.
Here we go.
Go for it.
Drum roll, please. When I was a kid and he was governor, my great uncle Nelson once asked me to pay for something. Number 2.
Keep going.
I have been to Burning Man multiple times. Number 3, during my extensive travels, I studied Cantonese.
Oh. I'm going to say number 1 is probably true for what I know about Nelson Rockefeller. But maybe I'm going to say you've been to Burning Man once, but not multiple times. I would say number 2 is the lie. Emily?
I was going to say that too. I'm like, you've been to Burning Man once and we're probably over it quickly. And then we're like, never again.
Envelope, please. Survey said number 3. I've actually been to Burning Man 5 times. You're right about Uncle Nelson.
What?
I'm very impressed with your history. He was an infamous skinflint. My mom said he was trying to teach me something, but the real truth is he never had any cash on him. And I actually did not study Cantonese, even though I lived in Hong Kong for a summer, which you may have seen. So I thought that there you go.
Congratulations. The second person to stump us. I didn't want to say this about your uncle, but he was kind of notorious. I know that.
My God.
Do you think he didn't care? Well, first of all, let's not forget that's how wealthy people get wealthy. They actually don't pay for anything.
Well,
so the one who throw money around never laughed.
But I'll just say that famous quote for Nelson, because he was always, saying the family wasn't that way. So someone finally said, Governor Rockefeller, you come with this incredible wealthy family. How much money do you need? Just a little bit more.
Let me ask you this about your family and about Nelson Rockefeller. So what do you think he would make? Since he's the guy that really coined the Nelson Rockefeller, he didn't coin it, but that's what people were talking about.
Well, he was the one. If you look at tapes from him in the 1964 Republican convention, talking about clairvoyant, was worrying about how the party was becoming too extreme. So, but he was someone, he was one of those great politicians like Bill Clinton or Lyndon Johnson that, and decidedly not like Al Gore, John Kerry, and Hillary Clinton. That it didn't matter whether you were the coal miner from Appalachia or you had the PhD from MIT. He was right there with you. He felt like you were the most important person in the world. He could talk about anything. And so I think that he would have been someone who would have realized the trends. In fact, the bottom line was, if it hadn't been for the fact that he left his wife in 1962 to marry Happy, which people couldn't tolerate that, I think he probably would have been president.
Do you think that Uncle Jay would be elected in West Virginia in this environment?
Yes, I think he's like a Joe Manchin in the sense that I think he would have run one more time if he hadn't had some health issues. And also he was someone who always cared about policy. And so I think he was just having, particularly after the Tea Party came in, those last 5 years of his term, he said were the worst years he spent in politics, because he just saw everything decaying. He saw, people not caring, not doing their homework, not realizing that, policy matters, that it was all about purity. And so I think that, but, I think in West Virginia, he would have been fine, because again, he was someone who went and visited all the counties. He really, he was like, he was like a A great example is Sherrod Brown in Ohio. He's another one of those guys. Every time the
Yep.
state gets more red, he keeps winning by a higher margin. So it is.
I love.
Yeah, it is possible. Again, you just have to pay attention to the things that voters care about.
Well, let me say something about him on a personal level,
Yeah.
because I did overlap with him when I worked in the Senate. God, 20 years ago now, if not longer. But I was very close. I did not work in the Senate for Senator Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey, but I was very close personally to Frank Lautenberg, Senator Lautenberg. And your uncle was just astoundingly great with him and amazing to him, especially towards the end of his life. And back when he needed a little extra help in the Senate, of his life. And he really stepped up in ways that are just remarkable. And I've never forgotten it. And I know that I'm sure the Lautenberg family has not forgotten it either. So on behalf of that, I don't want to speak for them, but on behalf of myself, I want to thank you for that. Thank him for that. He was an incredible man and a very kind man, I think.
Well, yeah, humility is something that was drilled into our heads. Humility and never, ever, ever be entitled. And that's what you see with so many young people these days. It just drives me crazy. I mean, granted, with all the physical challenges I've been through, I just appreciate everything. I would never come across, never be entitled. But Jay was, I remember he said that when he first got to the Senate, he became friends with John McCain because he admired so much of what he'd been through. He's like, my life has been the opposite of what you've been through. And they became fast friends and were friends throughout his entire career there, just because of that.
But I'll also say this about you saying that, and about, as you said, about Jay Rockefeller and your family. I mean, compare that to what you see with kids growing up, my generation, and not just my generation, younger kids of very wealthy, prominent families.
Yeah.
Look at the Trump kids. I mean, I hate to say this, but who's more entitled than Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner waltzing?
Jared is. You talk about white privilege and
Yeah, I mean, just waltzing into the White House and just assuming they're going to co-run the government because of, they were in the Lucky Sperm Club. And it's interesting. And not just that, I could, name certain other children of senators who behave that way. So I think it's lovely that you grew up with that mantra and that your family did, considering where you come from. And I really wish that was still the case with a lot of people who have famous last names like yours. I just don't see that happening as much.
Yeah, sadly, it's not.
Yeah.
But this has been so much fun.
Yes, thank you.
Great chatting with you.
Talking to you. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime.
Julie, that was an incredible interview. And again, the sparkle in your eye, I think everybody who just listened to that is going to really get something out of that and have a great conversation about it.
Yeah. So there was a sparkle in my eye. It was obscured by these ridiculous $1.50 cheater frames that I get at like Walgreens or Duane Reade or somewhere. So great discussion, and we will be sure to have him back. What's been going on with you? I've not caught up in a long time.
I know. Well, I did a little mini dry triathlon. I won that.
Wait, what? Back up.
Yeah, it's part of this Orange Theory fitness thing, but they have this dry try, which you sign up for, and it's 2,000 meter row, a 5K run, and 300 reps on floor exercises. And I won the little mini studio thing. So that was really cool.
Oh my God. Well, I know somebody who's going to be really interested in that. That's amazing.
And then I ran a 10 miler last weekend. I'm helping a friend train
for fun.
Yeah. Well, she's training for a marathon, and another friend, her wife was like, I can't run. Do you want to run it with her? Like with 2 days notice. I'm like, yeah.
I walked from my house to my car that's parked in my driveway today. But I feel very accomplished.
No, well, you've been just like changing the landscape and empowering women. So tell me about, how are you doing?
Oh my God. Well, thank you. I've been spending all my time on Lift Our Voices stuff, really just doing incredible stuff, still trying to raise money for our mission. Fundraising is the toughest part of for me at least, of doing this, because it's just something that I don't particularly love doing. I don't love asking people for money, but obviously whenever you are running a nonprofit, you need money to do that. So have been doing that. Went down to DC for a few meetings last week on behalf of Lift Our Voices. And I had not been to Washington in a long time, I think since before COVID hit. And and certainly since Donald Trump was president, it was nice. I mean, it was a nice in and out. You know what I did see when I was down in DC? So I had a lunch meeting at the Willard Hotel, which is right by the White House, just across from the National Mall. And then I had about 45 minutes or so to kill. So I decided to walk over to the mall because it's just the kind of thing I don't ever do when I go to DC. And I went by the Washington Monument where they have this COVID memorial set up. And these little white flags that are very tiny white flags that they have set up that they've planted on the lawn by the Washington Monument for every person who's died of COVID in this country. Oh. And it was just a breathtaking, sometimes you see these memorials and you're like, whatever, this is hokey. It was just breathtaking. It was just a beautiful, amazing sea of white. With the Washington Monument, which obviously is also white and very tall, kind of rising up from this very vast field of little white flags. Really just amazing, just an amazing, amazing visual. And so I posted it on Twitter saying just exactly what it is. This is a monument to, memorial to the people who died in the wealthiest country in the world. Because, of course, as the wealthiest country in the world, we have the healthcare system or should have the healthcare system to deal with this. And for a variety of reasons, our hospitals are overwhelmed and whatever, because people are not taking a vaccine that they should be taking for whatever reasons they're not doing it. But I didn't get into all of that. I just said this is a memorial to all the people who died in the wealthiest country in the world. The crazy vitriol I got back from people on Twitter was just really striking to me. Just shows how everything is so partisan now. I wasn't making a political statement. I wasn't making a value judgment.
It's a fact.
It's a fact.
You were honoring the people who were being memorialized.
Yeah, there are 600,000 and more white flags planted on the National Mall in honor of the people who died. I'm not making a value judgment about their death. I'm just saying they're dead. Sadly, I mean, this is and if I had gone down a couple of yards to the Vietnam Memorial, which is also right there, and tweeted that out, would I have gotten this craziness about why are you getting, political about the Vietnam Memorial and there are people like, no, I wouldn't have. But for some reason, COVID has just become the very fact that people are dead. Somehow people take as a political statement. There are memorials all over the place.
No, I remember when you went to France, you posted about like the memorial there, I think, for World War II, and you didn't get that vitriol. Like,
it's crazy. Like, okay, I could have gone down to the Jefferson Memorial. Would I have gotten crazy vitriol about a memorial about, his treatment of enslaved people on his properties? No, I wouldn't have. I mean, I don't think I would have. It's just a visual of a memorial. Or the Lincoln Memorial, would I have gotten this whole, the Lincoln Memorial, how dare you talk about, a man who defeated the Confederacy? Like, what? That's not political. Tweeting that out's not political. Washington, Washington Memorial is not political, even though he didn't do some great things to slaves and his people who were enslaved and his Mount Vernon. I mean, so on and so forth. Like, but COVID is just something that people go crazy about. And it just kind of depressed me because I'm like, how are we ever going to get through this thing if the mere fact that I'm tweeting out a picture of flags in the National Mall in commemoration of dead people from a pandemic is something that everybody goes ballistic about? It was just, I don't know. It's depressing. The whole thing is depressing. Having said that, Lift Our Voices is not depressing because we are working hard to change policy. And we're going to California. I'm very proud to say about a month ago, hopefully Gavin Newsom will sign that into law soon. Just passed NDA ban, very similar to New Jersey's, which means that if you're in California, nobody can enforce an NDA on you. That's not for proprietary trade secret information. So if you're sexually harassed, for example, you can talk about it. So what's making you salty this week, Em?
I've been following all the Britney stuff, so I'm so glad her father is no longer her conservator. But I don't know if you got to watch the new New York Times one on Hulu and then the Netflix one.
I didn't.
But all the crap that amazing woman has gone through. I am so glad, and I hope she is free soon. So I would have to say it's making me salty to learn about what happened to her and what the justice system that you are fighting against right now has done to constrict her and take away so many of her rights. That has made me very salty.
We've talked about this before, but you and I both know full well that Britney would never have been subjected to this if she were a guy.
No, absolutely not.
Plenty of guys have gone off the deep end, but I mean, I'm happy for Britney. I'm happy that she's getting married again. I hope, that this one lasts.
I know.
Yeah.
What about you? What are you salty about? Well, I mean, except for the vitriol that you got on Twitter over a memorial posting.
I'll tell you what I'm salty about. I'm salty about the fact Kristi Noem, who's the Republican governor of South Dakota. What am I talking about? North Dakota. She's the Republican governor of South Dakota. This right-wing Trump blogosphere puts out this article. I'm going to sit here and defend her because I can't believe I'm defending her. She and I disagree on virtually everything in the world. But this right-wing, and let me stress again, right-wing publication writes this unsourced thing about her having an affair with Corey Lewandowski, right? Who has been a long time established horrible human being back to when he decided to grab Michelle Fields, a reporter who was covering him back in 2016. But allegedly they're having this extramarital relationship, which I really couldn't care less about, except to say that this article, again, written by something called American Greatness, which apparently is a Trump supporting outlet, is basically saying something along the lines of, well, this kills her chances of becoming president in 2024, getting the nomination in 2024. Really? This is coming from a Trump supporting blog?
Yeah.
Really? Why? Because she's a woman? Because Donald Trump, a man, apparently that's just locker room talk that boys talk about, grabbing women by the you-know-what and cheating on your wife with a stripper and cheating on your wife with 100 other women and on all three of your wives, I should say. But that's okay. But This obviously kills having an extramarital affair, which, by the way, is completely unsourced, and this is just a horrible rag piece. I'm going to defend her here and say there's no evidence of this whatsoever. And even if there were, if I'm a Trump voter, why do I care?
Right. I mean, you've already established you don't.
You already established you don't. So, but you know why? Because she's a woman.
Yeah.
Because she's a woman. So here you go. I, a liberal Democrat, am defending Kristi Noem, who speaks at CPAC and brings down the House there, purely because I think she's getting completely screwed as a result of being a woman, kind of like Sarah Palin did in 2008. Anyway, that was a great, great, great interview. And Em, you and I have a breakfast date next week, which I'm very excited to actually see you in real life. We haven't seen each other in months and months. And have a wonderful weekend. And we will do this again much sooner than the last time we did this.
Truth. Talk to you later.